as well, when you walk through the exhibition, and as will know, we had to select about 80 works to display from 400. We really need the second part of the National Gallery building to fit the rest in. So it's been a really difficult decision as well. But I'm really pleased with the way that it's come out. I think it does do Bendel's practice justice, and it introduces new people to his work, but reminds many of us who have been on this journey with Bendel for a very long time just the remarkable skill that he has and the quality that transcends a lot of what we see day to day.
Could you sketch for our audience his journey? So what I mean by that is his childhood in West Bay, his family background, and then his decision to pursue a career as a professional artist, which was an unusual one for a young Caymanian at that time, to say the least. And then his subsequent life in New York, where he really kind of found his voice and established a name for himself. So.
I think it's a really critical question, because what we're trying to do with this exhibition as well is really remind people how remarkable it was to forge a full-time international career in the visual arts from that early day. You know, it's not like Cayman is today, where we have National Cultural Foundations and galleries and the National Museum and all sorts of wonderful pop-up commercial spaces and people that are really invested in collecting the visual arts and supporting artists. Cayman in the 60s was a very, very different place, and in a moment of significant transition from one type of country and economy to the economy that we see today. And of course, we're all grappling with that rapid, sometimes turbulent transition in our own respective agencies and helping people navigate that on a daily basis. But I think if you sort of think back, and Will has a really fantastic biographical essay in our new Bendel Hydes catalogue, that kicks off with this vision of Bendel sitting under a sea grape tree on the beach in West Bay and sketching as a young boy and doing that in quite an isolated environment because there weren't many people sketching and doing visual arts. A lot of incredible functional craft and creativity, which Cayman has a very, very long and creative legacy of. But to actually forge a career in the visual arts, and to put it in perspective, when Bendel wanted to get a qualification in art, there was so little available in the school system that he had to sign up independently for a correspondence course at sort of 14, 15 years old and do it himself. And he was actually the second Caymanian to do that, so not the first, but he was the first then to go away and choose to do a foundation course at the Liverpool College of Art. He didn't receive a government scholarship at the time because there was really no wider understanding of how that professional development experience could then translate into a job and revenue, which were really the boundaries or the caveats of the scholarship system in those days, and it still is. But I think it's so critical to introduce that moment of transition and that courage that it took to break away from what was a very conservative society in those days, again in a stage of transition, and actually have the stubbornness, maybe, if we all know Bendel, to continue pursuing this career. And I think he was also very, everyone that knows Bendel really understands just what an incredible intelligence that this man is. And we'll get to that conversation about how critical that is to the level of his work. But I think he was pretty savvy as well. You know, he changed his art degree to go and study political science so that he could get some support from the Cayman Islands Government, and then spent that time in his undergraduate degree at Clark University, painting, taking commissions to do portraiture, and working on the student newspaper. So never deviated from this commitment to his artistic practice, but found ways of managing that. I think it was quite a challenging time when he moved back to Cayman in the 70s. You know, there was really a band of creative university graduates coming back, Frank McField, and I know Henry's going to speak to this more at the time, Anita Ebanks, really starting to make change through the establishment of the In Theatre. But for the visual arts, it was, I think, still quite isolating. You know, we know that he worked incredibly hard to establish the McField Square Galleries, really our first contemporary art gallery. I think there was certainly exhibition opportunities in Cayman, but more driven commercially or from a tourism standpoint. And Cayman wasn't quite ready for Bendel, I think, in the late 80s. Whether it has ever become, we're hoping that it is now. So really needed to go away and be part of that incredibly creative community in New York. And of course, that was the starting point to this remarkable journey that we've seen him go on for many years, and which we'll talk more about later in the conversation.
I know you've been deeply engaged with Bendel's work for many years. I've read many of your exhibition reviews of his early exhibitions, and also your interview that you did with Bendel, I think, in 2002. In terms of your connection to Bendel, Henry, I was thinking, in terms of your long-term roots at the Cultural Center, you could perhaps talk about Bendel's significance through the lens of theatre and the performing arts. I guess firstly with regards to his involvement in the co-founding of the Inn Theatre in the late 1970s and the subsequent development of the Harkwell Center and what we now know as CNCF, but also his involvement in hosting teaching workshops at CNCF, and more generally being an inspirational figure to subsequent generations of creative talent.
First of all, thank you for coming. And I just want to say to Natalie and the National Gallery, what an incredible job they have done with this, and what a significant moment this is, I think. And I think that many people are not really going to fathom what is happening, not just here tonight, but with the entire exhibition, with the effort that it takes to do this kind of work. So I want to personally, outside of the foundation, congratulate them and thank them for this particular work. I know Bendel would be happy. I don't know that I'm a good historian in terms of remembering facts. I sort of remember the forest. And what I remember of the period when there was this sort of confluence. You had Anita E. Banks, Art Lynn Pedley, Bendel Hydes, Frank Markfield. Who am I leaving out?
Jeff Cresswell.
Jeff Cresswell was here, yes. As a matter of fact, Jeff was one of the people who helped to pull a lot of these people together. He was instrumental in that. He had worked in Jamaica for a couple of years and then came to Cayman, I think around 1979. I don't remember the exact date, but he was one of them. And I think it was a moment when many Caymanians, these 4 or 5 people, thought that it was time for them, with a society that was now emerging out of the era of the turtling and so on, into being a community which invited people in to help with the growth of the country. I think that they somehow had this sense that they would have to have something to build something. And again, the significance of them working together. Because remember, you had a playwright, Frank Markfield. You had a historian and somebody who was, I would call her a cultural activist. Anita, who was very much interested in Caymanian history, Caymanian culture, and all things Caymanian culture. You had Bendel Hydes, who was an artist, meaning in the true sense of the word, because they're all artists, but Bendel was essentially a visual artist and a painter. So here you had almost all of the arts, and you had Arthur Lynn, who was writing for them also. And Frank was just beginning to write. And out of that, the group of people came this incredible body of work. If you look at what Anita has done at the museum, if you look at the works that Frank Markfield has done with the plays that he's written, I mean, nobody else since the 1970s have written like that. Nobody else, I'm talking about Caymanians, have painted like Bendel. And it was really, really a significant period that they all went their own ways after a time. And it would have been interesting if they had stayed up together, maybe another 5 or 6 years, to see what we might have been talking about today. But they created works that are going to last for a very, very long time. I mean, their names are going to be written permanently in the history of the Cayman Islands.
We were talking about how Bendel perceived himself in terms of his identity, but I also think one thing that we've learned through this process is how long it took for him to get recognition from society more generally here in Cayman. And I think part of that was the degree of institutional validation that came from presentations of his work. And so while you're here, I wanted to ask you, Nancy, about that exhibition in 2003 that Natalie alluded to, Soundings. Because for me anyway, that volume was very important as we were doing our research on a practical level for identifying works, but also for me that exhibition was a monumental accomplishment that really put Bendel on the map and made people here aware of just what he'd been up to in New York while he was away. So I think, could you maybe speak to your experience as a young, new director of the National Gallery, which itself was still a very young institution, growing institution, and kind of the process that went into that exhibition and that whole project?
So Natalie and I have always had slightly different approaches. I was perhaps a little, like, it's a bit scary sitting between you and Natalie, because I find you're both able to look at a piece of art and dissect it, and the art historian background and the research, and I'm coming at it more from a sort of a culture and history and heritage, very, very wide background and a sense of place and identity. So to take it back to that, growing up, I got lessons from Ed Oliver in that same little building you mentioned, Henry, in South Church Street, and so did Bendel. So people like that. And I remember Bendel and them saying that they couldn't get art supplies, paints here, until, I don't know the year, probably you guys do, but it was like early 60s, mid-60s. So that in itself was a problem. But that was, as you said, Natalie, coming out of the era where Caymanians, we were living to work off the land because, we didn't have a lot of time to delve into things of fancy, of creativity on that level. It was more the creativity with the crafts. So there was a bit of a divide, a bit of a split in the 60s and 70s when finance industry bloomed and tourism. But then Bendel went abroad, but then I always think, it's fascinating he went abroad, and yes, he's an international artist and a Caymanian artist, but, so many of his forefathers and our forebearers went abroad as well. It was the quintessential Caymanian thing to do. So that was not hugely uncommon. It was just uncommon for someone to eke out a different art form going abroad. So I visited him in New York around the showtime and mounted the show, but I was never your pure curator in the sense that Natalie is.
When we look at Bendel's work, and we had this amazing and really inspiring seniors tea party last week, and we had 75 seniors here, of course, who have known us since we were kids or have known Bendel since he was kids, and we know that the sort of public appreciation of abstract art can be a real challenge. It's not necessarily very accessible art. And when we were doing this project, we were interviewing people like Frank McField and Steve McField, and Steve's like, I don't understand why he moved away from that realist stuff. The schooners and the catboats are amazing, and it's true. And if behind this wall, you'll see that we've grounded this exhibition in these very early figurative works. Again, we were stuck with those 400 pieces that we had to select from. So we started the journey of the exhibition with these beautiful expressionist, semi-abstract works that you see behind us today. But Nancy touched on something very important, as did Henry, in absolutely, Bendel is an international artist, and that's what makes him stand apart, I think, still from our burgeoning and very creative arts community, is that Bendel represented Cayman in ways that Caymanians don't even know yet, In the 90s, there was a series of really important survey shows of Caribbean art, and it was really a major shift in the global art world to focus back on the Caribbean, sometimes in a bit of a tokenistic way. They weren't all necessarily successful projects, but they certainly raised the bar in terms of professionalizing the art sector in the Caribbean. And Bendel was in all of those shows. So again, for the general public, that might not sound that exciting, but to be selected for some of these survey exhibitions, you're competing with some of the best, brightest minds in the region. And I mean, that was what inspired me as a young curator to really understand and pick apart all of those things that Bendel has been doing outside of our island. And so I absolutely agree, Henry, that's really what the benchmark has been set by this international practice. And And Bendel and 3 other Caymanian artists have just been selected for this A to Z of Caribbean art, which is being published. It's just been launched in Trinidad, and I contributed writing to it. And again, that benchmark was very, very high. So to see those 4 Caymanian artists now in this international capacity, in Bendel's case, just being reconfirmed and reinstituted in that respect. But Nancy touched on this idea, and I absolutely agree with you when you're talking about curating soundings from a cultural and historical perspective, because this is what takes me back to this idea of abstract art. So I'm chatting to 94-year-olds going, what, you know, I love the colors, but I'm not really convinced by this stuff. And then you start talking about what it's inspired by. And of course, Bendel is inspired by his New York experience, but he's absolutely inspired and never leaves this connection to home. So it's a bit more obvious in this room, these very bright tropical forms, the breadfruit, the yellow leaves behind me, which belongs to the National Museum, and it's very kindly on loan. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, and we've borrowed that a few times, I think, over the years. And then we move into the second part of the exhibition, which does move into more pure abstract expressionism, and ultimately a style that Bendel has phrased luminescent abstraction, which really, when you look at the work and lit properly in a professional gallery, you can completely understand where this sense of luminosity comes from. But when you stop and you talk about these works, and you talk about the history, you talk about the maritime connection that really underpins nearly every painting that he's created, they become really accessible to any age group with any level of background in terms of art speak, which can confuse even most of us. And I think that was one of the most inspiring moments so far with the exhibition. And it was a group from West Bay. We had one Bodden Towner in there. They said they were very brave to be part of the West Bay troupe. And they were just having an amazing time. And when we started talking about soundings and fathoms and, you know, mapping the routes of turtle fishermen down to the Mosquito Keys, which underpin a lot of these huge abstractions, we realized that Bendel never lost this connection to home. And I think that's what makes his work so incredibly moving to me. He can be international, he can be respected internationally, and he can be accepted as an artist of a very, very high caliber of art, which you need to be accepted internationally. But there's always this connection to home, whether that's a nostalgic gaze, whether that's an unpacking of this maritime history. And I think that's what makes him truly unique in this conversation.
I had a memory of going to visit Bendel, and I'm sure we've all visited him in his New York studio a few times, but looking at him painting his work, I don't know if it was his later years where his eyesight was getting a little worse, but I just remember seeing him, if he always did that, I don't know, but leaning over the work on the floor. And what happened then was, when I looked really closely, and Natalie mentioned, you know, the fathoms and the soundings and all those nautical terms, but the thing that struck me is the show that I did, there was a lot of texture in that show, a lot of the reef and the textures, but you could also see in some of the work eyelashes and perhaps eyebrow hair, and it was like part of his DNA is actually in the work, and that struck me as even more important because, again, you know, there isn't a day that goes by that I'm talking on one of these kind of events that I'm not sitting and going, wait a minute, we are all Caymanian, yes, but we really need to consider the difference that people who are generational Caymanian feel given the development and everything else. So, and consider that these artists and others are speaking about this. And I just feel as if they need to be afforded a voice. And so, yes, we're all Caymanian, but where is their experience and how do they impart it, whether it's playwriting or visual arts? So those are some of the things that struck me, and the way that he incorporated in the early days the sand and things like that. It was a very immediate response to the environment, which is one of the things the textile artist that came from the UK to the gallery, like 15, 20 years ago, a long time ago, she basically said, oh my gosh, that's the thing that struck me, is that you all have such an immediate response to the environment. And some of that is perhaps not that much international exposure, perhaps all you have to work with, that might have been the only medium, but it's just an endless source of fascination with what he can do with so little and not having that camaraderie of artists around him so much here before he went away.
Artists have to find a way of, and Bendel and I talked about it when I did the interview, of getting rid of the baggage. And I think that V.S. Naipaul once said, one interviewer asked him about about his life. He said, "My life is in my work." So if you look at Bendel's work, whether you know his past or not, you will see his life. So what the other day I looked around the exhibition and I hadn't seen almost, at least half of these works. I think that I like to put him into 2 or 3 sort of areas that each move from one to the other. And I agree totally that he's like I said, he's rooted in the Cayman Islands. And no great artist, you can name them, any one of them, they've all been rooted. Picasso is rooted in Spain. You see what I'm saying? If you know Guernica, if you know any of his, he's rooted. You cannot leave it. So that's a known. You see, a lot of the works in here, some of them are informed by what I would like to call nostalgia. So you have the nostalgic period. But artists have to move beyond a certain period where they distill their experiences, that they become gods. If I offend anybody by saying that, I'm sorry, but you have to become the being that you think controls you. You have to subsume yourself into the Godhead. And I think when Bendel found luminosity, he found the purity of vision. And to me, he's arrived there, and he can't do anything else now. I mean, even if he was physically fit, he couldn't do anything better than that, because he has distilled everything into a religious, sacred experience when you look at it. And that's what it's a benediction when I stand in front of those paintings, and that's what I really like about the phases of his work. That's just one.
And I think that's totally what sort of inspired us. We have filmed the entire exhibition in 3D, so you will be able to go onto the website if you're overseas, or you just want to keep going back and back and back to this beautiful show, that you'll be able to walk around and take your own journey through the exhibition. And we're trying to do that for all of our exhibitions now for archival purposes. But the Circumnavigating the Globe series, to me, is really the pinnacle. And I think it's because it's a full series. Of course, he's gone on to create work after 2010 that has been incredibly special. But because you've got these 12 large format, 78-inch squared paintings with just the most remarkable color and depth, this luminosity, as you said. When I curated the Circumnavigating the Globe show for the opening of the new National Gallery building, it was a spiritual experience. And you couldn't stand in that space, and hopefully without lots of other people around, certainly not on the opening night, but it was magical, and it makes me feel and think of Mark Rothko and the Rothko rooms at the Tate and the Rothko Chapel in Houston, that it's really Bendel having arrived at this moment of pure spirit and pure creativity. And I'm talking about that, and the hair's standing up on my arms. And to know that is homegrown, even if Bendel's been away and come back, it makes me incredibly proud to be a Caymanian and a creative person in this field, and to be able to look up to someone that has sacrificed an awful lot, as you said, has sacrificed relationships, has sacrificed, coming home, and could have stayed here and been a very, very big fish in a small pond, and chose not to do that. But it's that moment of pure magic.
And I wanted to switch gears and kind of look to the future a bit as we move towards the end of our discussion. I'd like to ask Natalie how Bendel has perhaps influenced younger artists and artists practicing today in Cayman, and do you see his influence in some of the contemporary work being produced here now? So, for instance, in the recent biennial.
Funny, it puts it into perspective, the year that we've had, sort of the contemporary and the launch of this huge biennial Tri-Island project, and then this celebration of our longest creating artist. It's been really pretty exciting, 2019. Most definitely, and I'm sorry that Nasara Soku-Cholet, who was actually the juried award winner, the Bendel Hydes award winner, no less, in the Cayman Islands Biennial, couldn't be with us tonight. She was going to be one of our panelists to talk specifically to that, how Bendel has influenced her practice, even though it's very, very different visually. Again, having a role model to look up to that was achieving international acclaim, I think, has been Bendel's biggest legacy so far, because there was very few people that as young creative Caymanians, whether, I mean, I can't paint to save my life, but I have chosen a creative career, and he's influenced me personally. And looking at those sacrifices as well, because Cayman is a very commercially driven country, and balancing this rapid development with the protection of our unique culture and our heritage is a big challenge. And I think a lot of our artists are really exploring that challenge and looking at ways of using their practice to comment constructively and try and make change. So I think certainly talking to someone like Nasaria, I was really inspired. There's a very young, exciting artist doing a lot of interesting things this year called Reno Jackson, John Reno Jackson, but known as Reno, who came because he'd heard Bendel was here. He was desperate to meet him, had his photo taken, and was just really, really excited to be actually able to engage one-on-one with this famous artist that he'd heard about. And equally, some of our other great artists, Chris Mann, Dreddy's here, David Bridgman, a lot of those artists were here or have visited Bendel since he's been back. And I think that really speaks volumes to just how influential he's been. And I think that influence will continue. And I think that was really at the heart of what we're trying to do with the exhibition, but specifically the publication. And I know Henry and Nancy, we've both spoken about this, is that we don't have a huge practice of creating academia around our own identity or our own culture or our own history. We have a few history books. We have some very old social studies books in the school system. So more and more, we're trying to redirect resources to creating publications that will have a lasting contribution to the academic debate and provide a source of research material for schools and scholars and artists. So with this publication, I think many more artists that might not have known Bendel directly or worked with him or had a workshop with him, and I do know that workshop inspired many of the artists that attended because we still talk about it today. But I really think that being able to create a catalogue that surveys this entire story will have a long-lasting effect and help us keep Bendel's legacy at the forefront of this debate.
Nancy, I'll follow up by asking you a question from your perspective. So I guess in terms of this importance that we've touched on about preserving Bendel's legacy for future generations, and specifically from your perspective of your current role in the Ministry of Health, Environment, Culture and Housing. It's a big portfolio. But the ministry has lent a huge amount of support to this exhibition and to the gallery in general over the years, providing funds to allow us to publish the book that Natalie just referenced, and also several key acquisitions over the past year, which we're very grateful for, that have really strengthened the National Collection. So why did the ministry feel this was a project worth supporting? And do you feel there's now a growing appreciation among your colleagues in government for just how important Bendel is to Caymanian culture?
I thought there were going to be some follow-ons. That's still a loaded question. Credit to where credit is due. Sometimes the people that come in, and they're the politicians, and they're the statespeople, and they lead things, they need to be thanked, because we had Minister Honourable Dwayne Seymour join a couple of years ago, and he has been absolutely passionate about culture.
Just to end, I'll ask this as an open question, because this is sort of a joyous celebration of Bendel's work and Bendel's life, but in that spirit of optimism, where do all three of you, I guess, see the arts scene in the cultural sector in Cayman going in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time? And why culture is so important, and what should we be doing to make it more of a priority, which Nancy has spoken to just now, but I wanted us to kind of end on that note, and then we can kind of open up the floor for questions.
But I think Cayman is slightly different, and I believe that with the gallery here, and if we can get education programs, if we can get the Ministry of Education to understand that the curriculum of the schools in the Cayman Islands must contain, not as a matter of doing an examination, but as a matter of doing art for art's sake, for the pleasure of finding that voice, of finding that vision, of finding your soul. If they can understand that, and kids can be started from the beginning, then when they get to the point where they can come to the National Gallery and to the foundation, we already have young people with the culture of the arts. They understand clearly what it is they're doing. I think the future is great, but it depends on how we calibrate the society, how the ministry calibrates its understanding of art, And because it's not just about Minister Seymour who likes the arts and loves the art, it is about a succession of ministers who grow into the culture of understanding what the arts mean, not just to making Cayman famous overseas, but to making the people of Cayman love themselves.
I want to speak to a couple of different points in that question. I certainly see, I mean, my practice at the National Gallery was actually 2002 is when I joined, when Nancy was director. And obviously I've been not here the whole time. I'm like, that would be too scary, but a lot of it. But I feel I'm still in this role because there's so much to do still. And yet, you know, I'm looking at the numbers of footfall traffic that we get. We're reaching over 5,000 students every year with a gallery tour. I mean, that's remarkable in terms of if you calculate those numbers with the number of students, there's about 22,000 people coming to the space. And no matter what various politicians think, it's a very diverse group of people. So that in itself, just the numbers in the door, says a lot to me. It's a very different amount than it was, you know, even 8 years ago. I think we have a long way to go in terms of professionalizing our sector, and I think this is where Bendel really stands out. And again, it's not just about creating, and I'm coming at it from the administrator standpoint. You know, Bendel is driven to create, as Miss Lassie was, as you are, as Nancy is, but he has also spent the time learning his craft. You know, he understands the vocabulary of art. And more than that, he just, you know, he's read and read and read, and his work is incredibly influenced by various cultural theorists throughout time, but certainly his Caribbean compatriots. And I think we're quite removed from that Caribbean conversation, and I think we need to hurry up and be a lot more part of it, because I think it is critical. I don't think we can exist in this region without understanding the history of the region and where we fit into that history. And I think that is what sets Bendel apart internationally. I think if more and more of our artists based in Cayman want the same kind of international acclaim, I think it is about things like getting a critique of your practice, you know, getting a curator to come and do studio visits, being open to critique. And I mean constructive critique. I'm not saying being critical, and there's a big difference, and there's a challenge and understanding around that sometimes in Cayman. But this is what Bendel's done, and I think this is where his legacy is maybe most important. It's showcasing what you have to put in to get the kind of acclaim that he has. It's more than just talent. It's more than just learning the vocabulary. It's the whole package. And I think we have a lot of exciting artists out there that are really doing more and more of this practice. I think with the emergence of other art establishments, like Art Nest is a great starting point for creativity. You've got more and more small pop-up commercial galleries and places to exhibit your work. If you're an emerging artist, you can still get a show. And that is really unusual in the Caribbean. I mean, Jamaica, who has some of the best art in the English-speaking Caribbean, there's hardly any commercial galleries. So we're in a very good place in terms of infrastructure. And I want to thank Nancy and Henry for their role in helping develop that. We've all worked incredibly hard. Peggy's here with us today as well, Peggy Lesher-Denton from the National Museum. So the behind the scenes is a really critical part of that. And I think another thing that we're doing at the gallery is encouraging people to move into this sector professionally and studying, you know, arts administration and management. And I think that's an exciting development. We're getting a lot of really bright university graduates opting into cultural careers, whether that's cultural entrepreneurship, as you said, or coming into the institutions and helping those expand and develop and stay relevant, right? We all have to develop and stay relevant.
I look at this as, and again, I wasn't the purist, I wasn't the sort of the curator, the art historian background. It was always, for me, about the youth, about the outreach, about the education, about let's go into the prisons and teach, and let's do, you know, if people are falling through the cracks, some of the young kids, let's get them in here. So for me, I see, and it goes right back to, I think, what has been the essence of this whole talk about having arrived somewhere. It's finding one sense of flow. It doesn't matter what you're doing in life. So when I talk about the arts and culture and identity and heritage, I'm talking about in the widest sense. Because culture is how we live, how we act, and how we interact, and all the trappings thereof, the religion and the way we dress and the way we talk. And so I see that whether you are into culinary arts or you're into fashion design or an installation artist or whatever kind of creative form you're doing, then I see a lot of amazing things in the future coming up, and I see a lot of interfacing with things that are happening. Why do we have to look at the heritage? Heritage and culture, they're similar, but they are diverse as well. You know, I don't share our generational heritage, but we're all living our culture now in Cayman. That's the differentiation, right? Now, I know Henry and I have had lots of dialogue on it. And one last thing, I'm looking at that aura a lot tonight. There's an installation in one of the Uglin building in town. I don't know if it's still there. Is it? It's in the book. Okay, great.
I had to scan your photo from.
Okay. So basically, he had this amazing hanging installation of all these ores. And why I mention that is because it's very important to have maybe an apprentice set up in the future. So it might not necessarily look like someone giving you money, but it could be an artist, an older, more esteemed artist giving you guidance. Or in Bendel's case, it was all the collectors. That's, again, very important, giving you the support and collectorship rather than just, we'll just get something that's mass-produced and stick it on the wall. Let's really build into our policies, having the tourism sector, the hotels and so on, supporting our local art. Let's look at crafts and look at what the gallery did the other day, where it was the art of fashion, and it was using thatchcraft and things. So there's going to be a lot of collusion with all of that, so it's all a very exciting place to be.
Take this newfound materialism and make some sense of it before it swallows us. Look to your deeper feelings about how you relate to your community and to what makes your community tick. So that, I think, is essentially what we want, is to all this wonderful materialism we have and everything that we have and these lovely things, make sense of it, use it to the advantage of, in this context, the artist. Thanks.
One thing was struck me there is talking about the plurality of creativity. You know, Bendel was not just a painter, and that's something that's new to many people. And if you have a look in the display cabinets we have in this room, you'll see examples of his poetry. You'll see examples of his prose, his creative writing. He was a big journaler. His sketchbooks, which are just filled with, I mean, what a crazy brain he has. I mean, because some of this stuff is a bit wild, but just this flow, this torrent of creativity, and it's just nice to get an insight into the inner workings of such a beautiful mind as Bendel has. And for me, those objects really convey that.
Thank you, Will. And I wanted to thank Will again for his remarkable contribution to the development of this exhibition, and also to Nancy and Henry, who agreed to be interviewed. I think we interviewed over 16 people. And again, this leads back to this idea there's very, very little material available. If you wanted to go and sort of research Caymanian art in a wider sense, not even just Bendel's life, but a lot of this is still in its primary source. So it's a very complicated journey to try and pull it all together, and I think we need to be doing more and more of this and funding more and more kind of academics and researchers to be gathering this material together. But it's been so exciting to do it, because you're on the front line of putting this into a secondary material for people to use going forward. But Nancy mentioned as well collectors. We had to say a huge thank you to the many collectors that loaned works for this exhibition. It's on for 3 months over Christmas, so they're going to have some very big gaps on the wall, because these aren't paintings that you can forget in your house. There are too many to mention, but of course some of the key collectors that Bendel always likes to have acknowledged, King and Lisa, or Clarence and Lisa Flowers, the Uglins, Susan Oldie, the McFeels from very early days. His brother Tristan Hydes, of course, has played a huge role in helping us coordinate all of these works. We've photographed professionally over 400 paintings, and when you look at how big these paintings are, lugging these from people's houses in a very professional manner, and then putting them back up and then bringing them back in for the exhibition has been quite remarkable. So a huge thank you to the collectors for allowing us access to their work. To all of the team that supported. And I did want to single out National Gallery Chairperson, Mrs. Susan Oldie, who is the lead sponsor for the project and has supported it through funds and also the loan of work and the donation of work to the National Collection. Really, without her vision, we would not have been able to achieve all that we have with this project. And again, it's not the end of a project, it's really an ongoing research opportunity. We'll continue to do more and more exhibitions, themed exhibitions on Bendel's work, so there will be a lot more coming. But this really has been a remarkable moment to be involved in, and I wanted to thank all of the panel and you guys in the audience, both members, artists, friends, colleagues, just a very big thank you.
Yeah.